Hey y'all, welcome back. So I want to thank you for checking out another video. I'm going back to my series on internal governance tips for founders today. I got a lot of positive feedback from that and it felt like y'all wanted to see more. So here we are. Today I'm specifically talking about how to go about formally appointing or electing an individual to serve in an officer role. So we've talked in previous videos about how we differentiate authority and how internal governance is structured within either an LLC or a corporation. As part of that discussion, if you'll remember, we talked about how we have our members or our shareholders, stockholders at the bottom of our pyramid. We then move to our board of directors, board of managers, or managers, and then on top of that, we have our officers. Our officers are the ones who generally run the day-to-day operations, the boots on the ground people that make sure everything gets done. And what we do from a technical perspective is we take little pieces of the board of directors or the manager's power and assign it to an individual so that they can oversee the technicalities of whatever area it is that they're in charge of. So there's really two things to keep in mind when it comes to properly appointing or electing an officer. And that is one, making sure that the officer position itself is properly created, and two is making sure that the individual serving in that role has been properly elected or appointed. And there are different ways to go about doing both of those things. As a primer, before we get into the technicalities, the document that you should be referencing for this conversation to figure out kind of what you're supposed to be doing is either your bylaws if you're a corporation, your operating or company agreement if you're an LLC, and then if you don't have either of those documents, you're operating likely under some sort of state business organizations code, which is a statute or a code book that you would be able to find online. So, what do we do? Obviously, I can't speak to every company individually because to be able to do that, I would have to look at your specific governing documents. But having looked at hundreds, possibly thousands of these types of documents, I can give you some insight into the typical setup and processes that we see when addressing this issue. So that first question, if you remember, is we have to make sure that the role is properly created. How do we do that? Generally, your agreement or your internal governance documents will require that you first properly call a meeting, generally of the board of directors or of the managers of the entity. However, occasionally you may see it required of the shareholders, stockholders, members, etc. But you have to call a meeting of someone. Someone has to approve it. Someone currently with authority has to approve it. For our purposes, I'm going to assume that's the board of directors or our managers. So we call a meeting of our board of directors or managers. If you have questions on how to properly call a meeting, look back to my first, I believe it was the first video in this series that talks about how to properly call a meeting. So we look to our documents, we properly call a meeting of either the board of directors or the managers, and on that agenda we have a couple of things we need to discuss. The first thing is we need to put together an official job description for this officer position. The second is we generally set some sort of compensation boundaries. And the third is we give them a scope of authority. So maybe their official job description is they are in charge of all technology acquisition and purchase for the company, and their scope of authority allows them to procure software and hardware and make server decisions or email decisions on behalf of the company, whatever it is. It is important when you're having this conversation, you're walking a fine line. You don't want to be too general, because if you're very general in the descriptions that you give for your officers, you're inherently giving them a lot of leeway and thereby a lot of authority. So you don't want to be too general, but you also don't want to be too specific, because they do still need to be able to do their jobs. And especially when you're talking about C-level executives, there's no way that a one-page or a half-a-page description of their position is going to be able to take into account every facet or every situation that they may encounter on a day-to-day basis. And you want to ensure that they have the authority to do what they need to do to be in their job and be successful at their job. So we don't want to make it too general. At the same time, we don't want to make it too specific. So that's the fine line you should kind of be towing when having these conversations internally. You can find general examples of these descriptions or scopes of authority online if you're looking for a place to start. I would suggest Googling some of those. So once we've put together this description of what this officer is going to have the power and authority to do and what their job looks like, occasionally you will see companies include compensation terms in the creation of this position. It is not always done that way. A lot of times, because especially with executives, compensation is going to be negotiated. Specifics of compensation are going to be negotiated with the individual. You're not going to see that included in your initial meeting. However, there isn't anything that would legally prohibit it. So it varies based on the situation you're in, but you at a very minimum need to have that description and scope of authority. So we put that together, we discuss that with our directors, board of managers, and then once we've done that, we get that approved. Now, keep in mind, there likely are going to be some positions within your bylaws or your operating agreement that have already automatically been created. Generally, you'll see president, maybe CEO, maybe one or two other typical positions, but I would reference your internal documents to see what's already been created. Do you need to go back and update the descriptions, or are you happy with them? And can you just use those without having to create new positions? So once we've actually created and authorized the position, the second thing we have to do is get an individual in there. In some bylaws and operating agreements, that requires a vote of the board of directors or the managers or board of managers. In some bylaws or operating agreements, there is a hiring manager or a hiring director that is allowed to make those judgment calls and have that final decision-making power on behalf of the entire board. It varies, so you need to check, like I said, your bylaws or your internal operating agreement to be able to do that. But the second step is to make sure that you've followed whatever that procedure is, be it a vote, be it appointment by a specific individual. You need to have followed that process. So once you have actually created the position, once they have been properly appointed into that position, then that individual serving in that role not only can properly assert to people outside and inside the organization that they have the authority and power that they're claiming that they have, but also they can rest a little easier knowing that they've decreased some of their potential personal liability for actions that they may be taking in the course of their job. If you have any descriptions, oh my gosh, my brain. If you have any comments, questions, etc., please feel free to leave them below, as always. And I also want to mention I am in the process of doing a giveaway. I will include more giveaway details down below, but I'm giving away one attendee ticket to the Collision Conference that's happening in Toronto this May. I will be making the announcement next Wednesday, the 27th. What you need to do to be eligible and to technically enter into the giveaway is included in the description for this video, so be sure to check that out. I can't wait to hopefully hang out with one of you and see one of you in Toronto in May. So feel free to let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to y'all again soon. Thanks.